chosen to put your children in an independent school, that is their peer group. If you changed states, jobs, moved across the country, likely that might be their peer group again, and it is useful to know where you fall in comparison. And then last but certainly not least, to check in on growth in learning at the individual student level. The standardized test score is just one piece of the puzzle, so absolutely should always be put in context, and I will say this again, of other teacher assessments, of classroom learning, etc. But it can be a nice piece to tell you where to ask those questions, right? So not to put too much weight on it, but certainly as a tool to check in and see how your student is progressing. So standardized assessment, right, is a very specific type of assessment. Multiple choice, typically. Students all take the same questions at the same level, same age group, same grade. There are state assessments, which are mandatory in most public schools, charter schools. The purpose of state assessments, however, is a little bit different. There are funding issues. Funding depends on some of those test scores, and mostly what they're testing is sort of basic proficiency and above. There's a lot of leeway in there. So our assessments tend to be a little bit more nuanced, but that also does mean that the results may not be, if you're coming from a national state test, they may be different than what you're used to seeing. They are long-term and summative. So in other words, the CTP is testing a full year's worth of material, which is different than a short-term classroom assessment. So the expectations when we're talking about a summative test, such as the CTP, versus a unit test, a quiz, a test at the end of a month or quarter, are different. So different assessments are used for different purposes. All right, so a little bit of background or content, come on in, on the CTP itself. And please do stop me if you have any pressing questions. I don't mind being interrupted. just gives you a little extra information on your student as a learner. Then we have the achievement subtests. These are word analysis, which is only going to be the third graders, auditory comprehension, reading comprehension, vocabulary, writing mechanics, writing concepts and skills, and then math. Worth noting always, because I was an English teacher, writing concepts and skills, this is a multiple choice test.
Check, check. Okay. All right. Okay, so page 2 of this report, this is the content mastery score that we were talking about earlier. It's a bit complex to wrap your head around what it really means, at least it was for me at first, given that I come from an English background, not necessarily math. But really the important things to think about and focus on in this report are twofold. So number one, you do get the information presented and attempted. Presented means it was in front of the student, they saw it. Attempted means they put an answer of some kind for it. Now, Phillips Brooks tests online. Therefore, it is extremely rare that a student skips a question. So most likely, you're going to see all these numbers being the same, and as we see with this student, they didn't skip any. However, if you're ever curious, does the score reflect, did they skip any? You can see that in this report. Most of the time, they didn't. Then you get the student percent mastery, and then you have a few different norm groups. These may not be the comparisons that you have. I don't know what comparisons you have on yours. Okay, so maybe you can tell me. So right here on this mock-up, we have the suburban norm group, the independent norm group, and GR would be compared to the grade level. That may be different from what you have. Okay, great. In which case, so the suburban norm is an interesting group. If you have SN, I should explain what it means. It is suburban public schools who are taking our test within the last 3 years. However, there are very few of those. 0 of them are in California. They're almost exclusively in the Northeast. And many of them are only using our test to identify gifted and talented learners because they are still mandated by their state departments of ed to give the state tests. So this SN, I typically tell people to just kind of ignore it. But if you're curious, that is what it is. Then you have the independent school norm group, and then GR is what was on mine. So essentially you're going sort of, the great thing about this, despite its complexity, is that it allows you to drill down into specific skill sets. So for example, writing mechanics was the one area for this student that could be looked at a little bit more closely. Again, this student, nothing to worry about, but since we're always trying to improve and support, that might be the area to look at. Now I can see, okay, spelling, capitalization, punctuation, and usage. Let's see, spelling, this student's average was 79 versus 63, so spelling is fine. Capitalization also fine. Ooh, punctuation, 21 versus 59. So it's really that punctuation piece of things that is bringing this student's score slightly down that is otherwise high. Then I can drill in a little bit further. Okay, the next question I would ask, which is something you would have to bring to your school, is how is the punctuation presented? What does that have to do with where my student's skill weaknesses might be, and how might we support that student? But now I know it's not sort of general writing mechanics in every sense of the word. The spelling is fine, the punctuation is where things fell apart. And yeah, so all of these sort of tables, that's what you're doing. You're sort of comparing the areas, the independent school average to your student. But you can see here, this is what I was talking about, the independent school average, and again, this is a high achieving group of students in schools, very typically 72, 66, 79, so it's quite frequently in that 60 and 70 range. Okay. Oh, go ahead. Yes. It's the percent, it's the predictive, it's what we predict based on your students' answers, how they would do if given every possible spelling question that our test could dream up. They would probably be able to answer 68% of them correctly. So then we have the graphs, and what these next two graphs are showing is just some of the same information as the tables, but in graphic format. So what this is showing me is, rather than on a table where I have to compare number to number, average to my student, it just shows me a graph. So the end of the beige bar, or I guess it's orange on this one. The end of the orange bar is the average for the norm group, and then the diamond is your student. So you don't get you do, it's a little hard to determine the exact number from this bar. Right here, it's probably 77. But it is easier to determine where those areas that your student is lower or higher. So anywhere where the student's kind of off in space, the diamond is way out there to the right. They're doing fantastically. They're really excelling. Anywhere where they're more or less right along the edge of the bar, they're doing just fine. They're keeping up with their peer group. And then areas where they are far to the left, this punctuation, which we already saw, those are the areas to then ask a few more questions about and see what might be going on. So, yes. Well, your student is an exact score, and then the bar is an average. Yes, these are all means. So on the individual level, we're never using medians. There's a couple of group scores that we have medians for, but it's always going to be a group average. Then we have this little graph, which is showing the percentile rank. In this case, the national norm, again, all of these things are customizable, so I don't know which comparison group you have on yours. It might be independent, but it's showing you the percentile rank in the big categories. The student score is the diamond, and then the bar in this case is what we call the probable range. Probable range is, from a statistical mathematical perspective, it's if I gave the student the same test level with a different form, in other words, same test level, same difficulty level, different questions, they might perform at the upper and lower echelon. The way that I like to think about it that's easier to wrap your head around is that the top of the bar is your student on their best day. They got a great night's sleep, had a healthy breakfast, they're feeling super confident. And then the bottom of the bar is they woke up cranky and tired, they stayed up too late, they had a fight with their best friend, and they're not thinking about the test that hard. The important thing, though, to look at, and I learned this recently, is really the overlap or lack thereof. We expect most students to be fairly consistent within their verbal abilities and within their math abilities. So I expect that there's a lot of overlap with verbal and then also with math. When a student is not consistent, that is another indication that I want to ask some questions. Something anomalous happened. So this student, despite their relatively high scores, there is some kind of funky non-overlap. The math and quantitative reasoning barely overlap. So considering that quantitative reasoning is higher, this is that student who enjoys higher order problem solving and may struggle with some of the structure. Now, whether that's because there was some gap in their curriculum, they moved around programs, they missed something fundamental, or they just need a little more structure in their math learning, to be determined, but that is unusual. And similarly here, I have these three verbal areas with a lot of overlap. Then I have writing mechanics over here and writing concepts and skills over here. So their ability to think critically about a piece of writing, very high, yet their kind of structural, mechanical performance is relatively lower, which honestly fits a lot with the learning profile of this high quantitative reasoning, relatively lower math. My guess, without looking or knowing this student, is that this is a student who loves to think and talk and think outside the box and problem solve and doesn't really like to stop and think about the steps and the structure. So these kinds of things can really help you think about your student, think about their strengths that can be celebrated, and think about ways to support them. For those of you with third graders, you'll get this additional piece, which is based on a task force of teachers and their criterion referencing of what is expected at the grade level. Developing means they're not quite meeting the expectation. Meets expectations, they're on grade level, no problem, and exceeds expectations. The nice thing about this report is that it gives you a lot of information about what the child was asked to do. But always take with a grain of salt with younger students. The reason we have this in more gentle language is that they are developing really quickly, right? Things can change. You could have a student who is struggling with reading and then something really clicks a month after they take the test, you'd get a different result. So always with the younger students, take it with a grain of salt. The other thing that you may have noticed, some of you, this developing often has a very high expectation. In the younger grades, the expectation of mastery, because we're talking about fundamental skills, they have to master certain things to be able to move on in the curriculum. So you may see, and I have seen before, the cutoff for meeting the expectation in certain areas is 88% mastery, which is a lot higher than we would say the average in the higher grades would be. There are reasons for that. It is about fundamental skills. But if you have noticed this in your child's report, you're not wrong. Nothing. It's not a mistake. That is how it is. All right, last but certainly not least, and in fact I would say this is the most important page of this report, is the student history page. We are working on, hopefully next year, having this be kind of a standalone, delightful graph that will give you 5 years of data. But for now, this is what we've got. This is the percentile rank in the various norm groups, which I have here, independent and national. And the scaled score, which is the important thing. So remember how I said scaled score is that measure of growth over time. So here, the student in verbal reasoning, 558, 544. That scaled score went down. That is not what's intended. That's not typical. So I'm going to red flag that a little bit and say, I wonder why that is. Let's see what's going on there. Then I want to look at the other verbal areas and see if it's similar. So reading comprehension, 501, 510, 606. Now they are going up, but I will tell you that 9 points from, what is this student? This is a 5th grader from 3rd to 4th grade is not as much as we'd like to see. But then again, they made almost 100 points the next year, so that may be an anomalous year. Then we have writing mechanics, which was our area kind of to look at. 423, 538, 551. So they are actually making growth in that area, and it may be that punctuation piece just needs a little bit of support, but overall they're making growth. Quantitative reasoning, 443, 544. Oh, sorry. Writing concepts and skills, 550, 645. That's fantastic. It's a lot of growth. Math, 300, 484, 555. Great. So all these areas look good. There's just a couple that I want to kind of keep an eye on. These can really help you determine what's going on. 3 years of data is best to identify trends because we can have an anomalous year. Now, unfortunately, you don't get 3 years of data until your students are already at the end of their career here. So 2 years can also be used as the starting point of questions. But just again, remember, this is for asking questions. What might be going on? Is there something that you notice in the classroom? Not necessarily jumping to conclusions. Oh, go ahead.
Why would there be a blank? Because we have some, can you go back one? See how there is nothing in 2017 and then so you have nothing to compare it to with the vocabulary there?
So vocabulary does not, yep.
Blanks.
Yep, so not every subtest is at every grade level. Vocabulary does not become a standalone until level 4. So before level 4, you will not see that. Auditory comprehension stops at level 3, so you don't see that here. Word analysis, this actually looks pretty similar to, so this student is a 5th grader testing at level 4. So those of you with 5th grade children, this actually looks exactly like what you will see. And so, yeah, they only had 1 year of vocabulary because,
I'm a 4th grader, so I can see a bunch of blanks in the 2017,
yes.
but that's why. Okay.
Yes, exactly. So not every subtest matches up. So the ones that do are, of course, where you're going to focus your attention. Reading comprehension goes for all levels. Math goes for all levels. So you can use the ones that you can. But yes, not every subtest is for every level. And last but certainly not least, the question. So here, for example, those of you who looked at this test last year, this report last year, the numbers were probably a lot smaller. The scaled score changed. You might have seen a number that was more like 275, and then this year it's 504, and you say, did they really make 200 points of growth? Well, not really, because the scaled score changed. With that change come slightly different expectations. In previous years with the old scale, what we used to say was 5 or 10 points of growth was what you wanted to see year over year. Now the scale has gotten kind of broader. There's some really great things about that. It allows us to track over 8 years, where our previous scale really only 3 was what you could compare realistically. But that means that the expectations are higher. So this little chart, which will be available to you, I must warn you, is a sample. This is why I call it sample. The reason is that we are new to CTP5, as are your students, and we do not yet have 3 years of students taking this new form yet. So these numbers are based on mathematical calculations, based on what students did on the CTP4 year over year. That scale then translated to the new scale. This is what we think we shall expect. These numbers will likely shift slightly as we get 3 years of CTP5 data. However, it can certainly be used as a good little guideline or rule of thumb. So you can see that generally from levels 2 to 3, we're looking at 30 to 50 points of growth. As the student levels get higher, so 4 to 5, they're all in the 40s and 50s. So just in general, younger grades, we're looking at 30, 40 points of growth. Up when they're 4 to 5 or 3 to 4, we're looking at 40 to 50 points of growth. If it's easier to kind of think about 40, that's fine to keep in mind. But as you can see, that 5 to 10 points of growth, which used to be what we were looking for, is not going to be enough. So when we were looking at this, that's why I said here with this 501 to 510, in previous years with the old scale, that would have been great, no problem. But with this new scale, 9 points is really not enough to be considered having made growth on the test. All right, so we are just about to wrap up. It's 9:30. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. I am here to answer some questions. I do have some time after, so if you don't need to go, it's fine for you to stay. But I'll just leave you with a few caveats about all test results. I'm sure I don't have to tell you this. I'm sure everybody really knows it, but I do think it's important to remind ourselves, right? Results from a single testing event always must be put into context. This is 1 week in your child's life. It is going to give you some great data. It is giving the school some great data. I believe very strongly that this test is a wonderful test, but testing is just one piece of the puzzle. It has its place, and everything needs to be put into context. Any true score is obtained by multiple measures over time, right? So we're always thinking about what happened during the test. Sometimes there are other factors. Now, I think it's fantastic that sometimes those other factors can be identified here in a cushy environment where your child is supported, and then we can take care of it. So if there is some anxiety, if there is some attitudinal stuff going on where they just decided they didn't care anymore, maybe we can figure that out from test scores and we can address that. Different kind of addressing than academic skill gaps, but still. We need to think about what was happening, how the items were presented to the student, the disposition of the student, what was happening in their own life, and then time and place. So always asking those questions of the teacher, of the school, what was happening. And sometimes, honestly, even asking those questions of your student. We spend a lot of time talking to the teachers about what's going on, but our students can tell us a lot. Your student may remember, oh yeah, I just didn't really care that much, or I was in a grumpy mood, or I got into a fight with my friend, or I was really nervous and scared. Get your child to talk to you about those things if the scores are not what you would have expected or thought. Talk to your child about it. And that, I think, is all we've got. Questions?
Thank you for being here.
Of course.
The slide on completed versus attempted, you mentioned for the schools that take the you administer the examination online, which obviously suggests that there are schools that take it on paper. Can you talk a little bit about how schools make that decision, and do you see a difference in the results?
Sure. So online versus paper. The biggest benefit to online testing is that the data comes back right away. It's scored instantly by the machine, as opposed to paper schools where they have to send us the documents, which we then scan through the Scantron machine that really hasn't changed technology since the 60s. It's pretty amazing. And it takes 3 to 4 weeks for them to get that data back. Certainly, there are drawbacks and benefits to both, right? So paper sometimes is more familiar to students. However, you have to bubble in those little results, which can be a challenge from a motor coordination sense. Yes, those of you who need to leave, please, I will not be offended. Go ahead and leave. From the online sense, most students feel very comfortable. It's the problem there becomes they sometimes move really quickly. They're used to clicking. Reading large passages on a screen can be different than paper. I would say that one is not better than the other. It's about what's best for the school. And in terms of score differences, we've run comparisons. There is no statistically significant difference between performance of paper testers and online testers, which is why we do merge those scores in terms of norms. That said, any individual student based on their own background, abilities, comfortability may do better or worse on one or the other. Yes. Yes.
So my question is about the correlation between the two. Is the ERB, are the categories and questions similar? In other words, like if you gave a fourth grader now a 1-year scaled back version of the ISEE, would they be likely to score very similarly on the ISEE to what you would see in the ERB? Or I guess the better way to ask the question is, for fifth grade students, are they seeing very similar results when they're taking both the ERB and the ISEE, or are there completely different categories?
Can I just add, similar, I was having the same question. Is there a correlation between higher stake and lower stake?
Well, okay.
Is there an effect?
Yes, so there is an effect and it is very individual. So to answer your question first about standards, yes, we do design both tests. Yes, they are based upon the same set of standards, so that NCTE, NCTM. Few key differences. Number one, the CTP is very granular. It's intended for curricular analysis, so they take it over the course of 4 days. It gets very specific. The ISEE is an admissions test, paints in broad strokes. The student sits down, they take it all in 2 hours, 2.5 hours. Also, the ISEE is always a variety of levels. So for example, your outgoing fifth graders will take the lower level test, which is for entry into grades 5 and 6. Now it's a pretty small range, but still there are some fifth grade questions, some sixth grade questions, whereas the level 5 CTP is only fifth grade material. That said, typically we see very similar results, right? The types of questions, the format is pretty similar. All circumstances being ideal, you would see very similar results. However, depending on the nature or attitude of the student, right? High stakes test admissions, some students, they kind of melt down, they get some anxiety. Also, they're asked to sit there for 2 full hours in a row, and fatigue can be also a factor. But you have the flip side where some students kind of blow off the CTP because they understand it's not that big of a deal, doesn't matter, and then suddenly with the ISEE, they try really hard. So in an individual student, you can certainly get a higher result or a lower result, but most of the time you should see pretty similar. If the student was truly trying their best and calm in both circumstances, you would see a similar result. Does that answer both your questions?
Areas where, if there are some areas where we can see maybe some growth is needed from the ERB, we could assume that that would be something to work towards for the ISEE also.
Yes, absolutely. So yes, if there's an area that's identified by the CTP as maybe there's some room to grow, and that is confirmed with the classroom teacher, yes, they could use some skill strengthening here, and you work on that, that should also improve the ISEE result in that same area, yes. Other questions? Okay, well, I am available. Like I said, if you think of things later, you can always follow up with the school. Thank you so much for coming, and have a lovely day, everyone.